Wyoming Territory, August 1878. The wind howled down through the red rock canyons of Sweetwater County, carrying dust and trouble in equal measure. Patrick Olander pulled his sorrel gelding to a stop at the edge of the trading post yard, his dark hat pulled low, boots caked with trail dust. He had not planned to stay long. Just pick up some feed, a tin of coffee, maybe a new bridle if the price was fair. But something made him pause, something in the way the air felt too still, too heavy. Then he heard it. A woman's voice, low and shaking, barely above the wind. "Please. Do not let them take me." Patrick turned his head. The voice came from the back of the trading post, where freight wagons were loaded and drunks sometimes gambled their last coins. He slipped off his horse and stepped quietly around the corner. She stood there, backed against a wagon wheel, her hands clenched. Her dress was torn at the sleeve, her face pale beneath a smear of dust. She looked young, maybe 20, and wild with fear. Two men stood near her, both of them with the look of bounty riders, rough and sunburned, one with a leather tie wrapped around his hand like a leash. Patrick's jaw tightened. "She is coming with us," the older man said. "You do not want to get between us and a bounty." "She is not a criminal," Patrick said flatly. "She is a runaway." "I do not care," Patrick said. "You are not taking her." The younger man stepped forward, hand on his revolver grip. "You really want to die for some girl you do not even know?" The girl looked up at Patrick, eyes wide and wet. "Please," she whispered again, voice cracking, "please do not let them take me." He did not answer her. Instead, he stepped up to her side, turned, and extended his hand. She hesitated only a second before grabbing his arm. "Get on," he said. She climbed up behind his saddle, clutching the back of his coat as he swung into place. The men shouted something, but Patrick kicked his horse hard and the gelding took off, hooves hammering the dry ground, a cloud of dust blooming up behind them. They rode fast, cutting through sagebrush and over low hills, until the trading post was a smudge on the horizon. When Patrick finally slowed the horse, it was hours later and they were deep in the folds of a narrow canyon, hidden from any trailing eyes. He dismounted and turned to help her down. Her hands trembled as they touched his, but she did not let go quickly. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, then shook her head. "No, I do not know." Patrick reached into his saddlebag and handed her a canteen. She drank, then sat down hard on a flat stone. "They were going to sell me back," she said after a long silence. "To the man I escaped from." He knelt nearby, careful not to crowd her. "Who are you?" She looked up at him, eyes steady now. "Tessa Vaughn." Patrick watched her for a beat. "I am Patrick Olander." She gave a shaky nod. I do not know how to thank you." "You do not have to." "I would not let them take a dog like that." Tessa's lips lifted in the faintest trace of a smile. Then her eyes dropped to the scar on Patrick's hand, the shape of it long and pale against his sun-browned skin. "You fought before." "Everyone has," he said. "Some fights are just quieter." The canyon faded into dusk. Patrick built a small fire and they shared what food he had: dried meat, a bit of hard bread. Tessa ate slowly, her eyes never quite leaving the dark edges of the rock walls. "They will be looking for me," she said. "They will not find you," Patrick said simply. Tessa looked at the fire. "He locked me in a root cellar, said he bought me fair so I belonged to him." Patrick's shoulders stiffened. "That is not how people work." "No," she said quietly, "but it is how he thought." They were silent a while. The fire cracked. The stars started to come through the black sky like pinpricks in cloth. Patrick stood after a while and offered her his bedroll. "You take it, I will keep watch." Tessa looked up at him, surprised. "You are not going to ask me anything else?" He shook his head. "You said enough." She hesitated, then she got up and walked over to where he stood. "You do not talk much," she said. Patrick gave a shrug. "I talk when it matters." Tessa touched his sleeve, light and unsure. "It matters now." He looked down at her, the firelight flickering in her eyes. There was a long pause between them, not awkward, just full. Then she stepped back and curled up in the bedroll. Patrick sat down near the fire, rifle across his knees, the weight of the day sitting heavy on his chest. But when he glanced over, saw her sleeping in peace for the first time in who knew how long, something eased inside him. He did not know what she had been through, only that it was more than any woman should have to carry alone, and he was sure of one thing. He was not going to let her go through it alone anymore. By morning, the canyon had cooled. The fire had long since burned down to ash. Dawn light filtered through the narrow walls, casting long fingers of gold across the stone. Tessa stirred beneath the blanket, her hair loose around her face, her breath steady. Patrick had not slept. He sat with his back to the wall, rifle across his thighs, listening to the hush that comes before the world wakes. When she opened her eyes, she looked around without panic. Her gaze found Patrick and held there. "I didn't dream it," she said. Her voice was hoarse from sleep. "No," he said, "you're still free." She sat up slowly, wincing as she moved her arm. The torn sleeve had dried stiff with old blood. Patrick stood and opened his saddlebag. "This'll sting," he said, crouching beside her with a small tin and a strip of boiled linen. She didn't flinch when he cleaned the scrape. "You know what you're doing." "I've had worse," he said, "and I've patched worse." "Soldier, scout," for a while she nodded but didn't press. He tied the cloth snug around her arm and sat back on his heels. "You got kin anywhere?" he asked. "There's a cousin in Idaho," she answered, "but I never met her, just letters my mama kept from before she passed." Patrick rubbed the back of his neck. "That's a long ride." "And if they're looking for you out here, they might look there too." "I don't want to go back east," she said quickly. "Not ever." He watched her a moment, considering. "I've got a friend runs cattle up near Olander. She takes in folks sometimes. Might be a place for you to lay low if that's what you want." Tessa looked at him, wary. "Why would you help me this far?" Patrick stood and began to saddle his horse. "I don't believe in leaving people to wolves." She rose, brushing dust from her skirt. "Even strangers," he glanced at her. "You're not that anymore." They rode through the narrow pass that opened onto sunlit prairie, the grass swaying high and golden. Hawks circled far overhead. They kept off the main trail, sticking to game paths and dry creeks. Tessa rode behind him again, but looser this time, her hands not clutching so tight. Around midday, they stopped at a small stream that wound like a silver ribbon through a cottonwood grove. Patrick watered the horse while Tessa pulled off her boots and waded in, the cold water rushing over her ankles. She tilted her face toward the sky. "You ever think about leaving it all?" she asked. Patrick knelt beside the horse, checking the girth. "I did once, after the war, thought I'd go east. Maybe build something where it's quiet." "Why didn't you?" He looked up at her. "Didn't feel like me. Couldn't breathe under a roof with paper walls and people talking soft all the time." She smiled, a real one this time. "I know what you mean." They camped that night in the shelter of a low bluff. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the smell of rain. Patrick set a tarp between two rocks and built a fire beneath it. Tessa sat close, warming her hands. "You think they'll keep chasing me?" she asked. "Not if they've got any sense," he said. "But men like that usually don't." She watched the flames. "If they come again, I won't run next time, I'll fight." Patrick didn't answer right away. He pulled his coat tighter and stared into the dark. "You don't have to." "Not alone." She reached over and touched his coat sleeve, her fingers light. "You already gave me more than anyone else ever did." He didn't say anything, but he didn't move away either. As the rain started, light at first, they sat beneath the tarp in silence. The fire hissed, and the wind moved across the grass like breath. Tessa leaned back against the stone behind her, watching the water creep down the canvas. "I've never felt safe before," she said. Patrick looked at her, his face unreadable in the dim light. "You are now," he said. "So long as I'm breathing." She turned her head toward him. Her eyes weren't sad anymore, just tired and clear. "Then I guess I'll stop running." The sun hung low when they reached the basin south of Beaver Rim, where the land opened wide and scrub gave way to pale, waving grass. Patrick reined in, scanning the far stretch where raw hills rolled gently toward the Wind River Range, their blue edges softened by heat. A pair of antelope grazed near a cottonwood hollow, lifting their heads as the riders passed but not fleeing. "I didn't think it would be beautiful," Tessa said, her voice quiet but clear behind him. Patrick glanced back. "You mean out here, I mean after," she said. "I thought I'd carry it in front of me forever, all of it. You still might, but it won't be the only thing." They rode on. By dusk, they reached a cabin tucked against a stand of pine, with a small barn and a sagging fence line that curved around a patch of dry pasture. Smoke rose from the chimney. A woman stepped out from the porch as they approached, wiping her hands on her skirt. She was older than Tessa, maybe near 40, with gray streaking her braid and a rifle resting casual in the crook of one arm. Patrick dismounted first. "Evening, Miriam." "Didn't expect you till winter," the woman said, eyeing Tessa with frank curiosity. "Plans changed. She yours," he shook his head. "She's her own." Miriam nodded once, then looked to Tessa. "You got a name, Tessa. You know how to mend fence, I can learn." "Good," Miriam said. "You can start in the morning." Inside, the cabin was warm and smelled of stew. Tessa sat at the table while Miriam served them both without fuss. The windows were small, but let in enough light to bathe the room in soft gold. Patrick ate in silence, boots muddy, hat on the peg by the door. After supper, Miriam lit a lantern and handed Tessa a folded shirt. "You'll sleep in the loft. Ladder's there. Mind the beam, it's low." Tessa hesitated. "Thank you." Miriam paused at the foot of the ladder. "He brings people here sometimes, not often. You're the first he stayed with." Patrick looked away. Tessa didn't. That night, Patrick sat on the back step, watching the stars slide out one by one. The air smelled of pine sap and old ash. He heard the loft boards creak, then light footsteps stopped behind him. Tessa stepped outside, wrapping the shirt tight around her. She didn't speak at first, just looked out over the dark pasture. "I didn't think you'd stay," she said finally. "I didn't think I'd want to," he answered. She sat beside him, knees pulled close, face turned to the wind. "My mother used to say there were places where the sky touched the ground," she said. I thought she was talking about heaven. Patrick tilted his head, watching the horizon. Maybe she was. They were quiet a long time, then Tessa leaned into his side. Not fully, just enough that he felt the weight of her shoulder against his arm. "I don't know how to start over," she said. "You already did," Patrick said, "when you asked not to be taken." She looked at him then, her face half-shadowed, her eyes steady. "You didn't ask me anything when you found me. I didn't need to." "I think I want you to," she said, breath catching. "I think I want you to know me." Patrick turned toward her, slow and deliberate. "Then tell me." She hesitated, then said, "My father was a cooper. He made barrels. I used to help him shave the staves. He died in the cholera when I was 16. After that, she trailed off, but he didn't press. I was sold twice before I got to Wyoming," she said. "I didn't even know where I was. Just that there was sand, and men who lied." Patrick's fist clenched against his knee, but he didn't speak. "I don't want that to be the only thing I come from," she said. "I want to be someone who rode away." He looked at her fully now, the lines of her face lit by lantern glow from the window behind them. "You are." The wind stirred the grass and carried the scent of smoke and pine between them. Tessa's hand slid over his, fingers curling slowly between his. He didn't move. "I don't need saving anymore," she whispered. "I know, but I want to stay." She said it like a question, though her voice didn't shake. Patrick turned his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Then stay." They sat like that for a long time, the silence softer now, the kind that settles between people who have made peace with their own ghosts. Above them, the stars burned steady, and the prairie held its breath as two lives began to take root in the same quiet soil. By late September, the grass had grayed at the tips, and the aspens near the creek behind the cabin had turned the color of butter. Frost came light in the mornings now, clinging to the fence rails and the backs of the horses until the sun burned it off. Tessa rose before dawn each day, pulling on her boots in the dark, her movements quiet but steady. Patrick had taken to the lower pasture with Miriam's gelding, breaking the colt she'd been meaning to train since spring. Tessa joined him more often now, her hands calloused from hammer and rope, her eyes sharper than they'd been when she first stepped off the trail. One afternoon, as wind rattled the dry cottonwood leaves, Patrick handed her a rope halter. "Try it yourself," he said, nodding toward the young paint gelding in the pen. Tessa glanced at him, then back at the horse. "He's still jumpy. Last time he nearly kicked the rail off." "You've got steadier hands than me," he said. "He'll feel that." She stepped forward slowly, rope loose in her grip. The horse tossed its head but didn't bolt. Her voice was low and even, her boots quiet in the sand. When she finally slipped the halter over its nose, she didn't look back at Patrick. She just reached up and touched the gelding's neck, her fingers light but sure. "You've got away with unsettled things," Patrick said when she came back out. "I was one," she said. They stood leaning against the fence together, watching the horse settle into a slow walk. "I think about what I'd be if I hadn't run," she said after a while. "If you hadn't been there." Patrick didn't answer right away. A hawk passed overhead, wings stretched wide, silent as a shadow. "Sometimes I think about what I'd be if I hadn't stopped," he said. "If I'd just kept riding." Tessa looked at him then, the sun catching the edge of her hair. "Why didn't you?" He didn't look away. "You asked me not to." The wind lifted again, tugging at the loose strands of her braid. She stepped closer, not touching him, just standing near enough to feel the warmth of his arm. "I want to stay through winter," she said. "If Miriam'll have me." "She will," Patrick said, "but that's not what you're asking." "No," Tessa said. "It's not." He met her eyes and the space between them stilled. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded once. "I've never been more." Patrick reached for her hand then, not quick, just certain. She let her fingers rest in his, the calluses scraping gently against his own. "Then stay with me," he said. "We'll build something here. Nothing fancy, just real." "I don't need fancy," she said. "I just want something that won't get taken." He brought her hand to his chest, pressing it flat over the steady beat beneath his shirt. "Then take this," he said. "It's yours." She leaned into him then, forehead to his shoulder, eyes closed. The wind moved around them, but they didn't. The pasture stretched out quiet and open, the gelding circling slow behind the fence. Later, Miriam stood on the porch, arms crossed as she watched them return from the pen. She said nothing, just jerked her chin toward the barn roof. "Needs patching before snowfall," she said. Tessa nodded. "We'll see to it tomorrow." Patrick turned toward the open field, but Tessa lingered by the door, her voice low. "Thank you," she said. Miriam raised a brow. "For what?" "For letting me belong somewhere." Miriam stepped back inside without answering, but the corner of her mouth twitched as the door swung shut. That night, Patrick laid a second bedroll near the hearth. Tessa didn't ask him to. He didn't need her to. They sat on the floor with a pot of coffee between them, her legs tucked beneath her, his back to the logs. The fire crackled low, casting warm light across the worn planks. "You ever think about naming the land?" she asked. He tipped his head. "Never thought it was mine to name," she smiled, soft and tired. "Maybe we just call it ours." Patrick reached over and brushed a soot smudge from her cheek with the back of his knuckle. "Ours sounds right," he said. Outside, the wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of snow not yet fallen. Inside, they sat close, quiet, and certain two people who'd come through the dark and found something worth holding in the light. The first snow fell in the night, soft and clean, blanketing the pasture in stillness. Tessa woke before the light broke, the cabin quiet but not cold, warmth still lingering from the fire Patrick had tended after she fell asleep. She sat up on the bedroll, the wool blanket pulled close, and listened to the hush outside. No wind, no creak of trees. Just the muffled silence snow brings when it lays over the world and makes it new. Patrick stepped in from the barn not long after, brushing flakes from his shoulders, boot heels knocking snow loose on the threshold. He set a pail near the stove and glanced over at her, his beard touched with ice. "Morning came quiet," he said. She stood and crossed to him, her hands slipping around his waist before she'd even thought it through. He didn't flinch, just folded her in, arms warm around her back, chin resting atop her head. They held there a while. Then she leaned back. "I want to build something," she said. "Not just mend and feed and patch. I want to make something new that's ours." Patrick's brow furrowed. "Like what?" "A house," she said. "Not just one room and a loft, a home, with space to sit by the window and watch calves drop in spring. A porch where you can take off your boots and not track in mud." He looked at her for a long moment. "You thinking we'd build it here?" "No," she said. "We've borrowed this roof long enough." He nodded. "There's a flat stretch east of the ridge, 2 miles from the creek. Good soil. Could cut timber from the pines up near Split Rock." Tessa's eyes lit, but she didn't smile. "You'd build it with me." "I wouldn't build it without you." They spent the next weeks clearing brush, marking the land with stones and stakes. Miriam lent her team for the hauling, saying little but watching the work with a faint tilt to her mouth that passed for approval. The cold deepened, but the snow held light, and the sky stayed clear enough to get the frame up before the ground froze solid. Each board Tessa nailed, each beam Patrick raised, they did side by side. No talk of past winters, no fear of what might come next. Only the sound of saw and hammer and the steady rhythm of two people shaping space where none had been. By January, the walls stood tall and tight, chinked with moss and clay. Tessa sewed curtains from feed sack cloth. Patrick carved a mantle from a fallen cedar, smoothing it with a rasp until it fit like it had grown there. The first night they lit the fire inside, smoke curling up through the stone chimney. They sat on the floor with tea steeped in a dented tin pot and watched the light flicker against the fresh pine walls. Tessa leaned against his shoulder, her voice soft. "It's warm." Patrick slid his hand over hers. "That's the way it's supposed to be." In the spring, they fenced in a small garden. Tessa planted beans in neat rows and scattered wildflower seeds along the edge, saying nothing about it, just letting them fall from her palm like they belonged there. Patrick built a lean-to for the gelding and a henhouse that leaned a little but held. He brought home a pup one day, found half frozen near the river, and it slept at their feet from the first night. By the time the grass turned green and the creek ran high again, they'd settled into something that didn't need naming. Mornings came with coffee and the sound of Tessa's boots on the porch. Evenings ended with hands dirt smudged, her head on his chest, the wind soft through the open window. One afternoon, as they walked the edge of the pasture, Tessa stopped and turned to face him. "There's something I haven't asked," she said. Patrick raised a brow. "Why you stayed," she said. "That day, at the trading post." He was quiet for a beat. "Then, because you looked me in the eye and didn't hide. Most people, when they're afraid, they duck their heads, but you stood there and asked to be seen." Tessa looked down, her fingers curling into his coat. "I never thought I'd be loved for that." "You are," he said. "You always were. You just needed someone who could see it." They kissed then, not rushed, not desperate. Just quiet and certain, the way things settle once they've found where they fit. That summer they planted 2 cottonwoods near the porch. One for shade, the other because Tessa said the sound of the leaves reminded her of her father's shop, wind rattling the slats piled by the door. By fall, the trees had taken root, and the garden had grown wild with squash and climbing beans. They never marked a wedding with paper or preacher. Miriam came down one morning with a fresh loaf and said, "Well, I suppose this makes it official," and handed Tessa a worn quilt stitched with wild roses. Patrick took a pair of silver buttons from the back of his drawer, his mother's, and sewed them to a new coat for her, his stitches uneven but strong. Years passed. The porch weathered. The trees grew tall. They added a second room when the space felt small. Tessa taught a neighbor girl to read, using the Bible and a dog-eared almanac. Patrick broke horses for extra coin, came home with bruises and stories that made her laugh. They never once spoke of the men who tried to drag her back. There was no need. Their life was not loud. It did not spread beyond the hills or make a name in any town, but it was steady and it was kind. They shared each day with hands that worked and hearts that healed, not from forgetting, but from building something larger than what had been taken. When the first snow fell again, years later, it came quiet as before. Tessa stood on the porch, a shawl around her shoulders, watching the flakes land soft against the earth she'd chosen. Patrick came up behind her, arms slipping around her waist. "Still quiet," he said. She leaned back into him. "Still ours," and it was, always.